Phyllis Weisberg. Good morning. Or I guess it's afternoon now. My name is Phyllis Weisberg. I'm a partner with the law firm of Montgomery McCracken. Many of you may know me from my prior life, where I was a partner in the firm of Kurzman, Carlson, and Frank. In March 2012, all the partners of Kurzman Carlson became partners in Montgomery, so that's how I ended up there. Kurzman Carlson had the distinction of probably being the first firm in the city to be representing co-ops and involved in representing co-op and then condo boards. We have clients that we have been representing since the 1940s that were co-ops way back then and remain among our clients. So we have been very much involved in the co-op condo field. I am currently chair of the co-op and condo committee of the City Bar, which is a beautiful building a little bit further down the block here, and where we're very actively involved in all aspects of co-op and condo representation, and trying to change some of the laws, and also learning everything we can to help our clients. Margie has asked me today to speak about two separate topics. One is the recently enacted legislation, Local Law 98, which was Intro 1085, and she's also asked me to address some issues about mold. They are somewhat interrelated. So let me start with the Local Law 98, which was enacted in November 19th. Greg, I think you said it's effective immediately. It's actually 180 days. Just almost immediately. Sandy exposed a lot of vulnerabilities. I don't know how many of you here are involved in buildings that actually sustain damage, but I think it was a storm that none of us could have quite imagined and no one expected. One of the impacts of Sandy was the formation of something called the Building Resiliency Task Force. It was a body of over 200 members, all volunteering their time, consisting of real estate owners, property managers, architects, contractors, subject matter experts, city officials, code consultants, et al. Under the auspices of the Urban Green Council, the members of the task force were appointed in consultation with the mayor and Speaker Quinn. They came up with a series of proposals, 4 of which have now been enacted into law. What's been enacted includes a provision that, that's much better, thank you. A provision that will remove some of the barriers to installing standby generators in buildings. There's another law that was enacted that will remove some of the barriers to putting up sidewalk flood protection. There's also one of the laws that was enacted deals with providing water in buildings that use electric pumps. That will become effective, and it is retroactive. It applies to existing buildings. That will become effective in 8 years. So you have 8 years to retrofit, but it will be that each building will have to supply at least one source of water for every 100 residents. And that will be presumably from the city main. We're assuming the mains will still be in operation. So any building that has an electric pump will comply. The law that Margie asked me to speak about today, Local Law 98, is a little bit different. It has 2 parts. The first part is really directed at the city. It directs the Office of Emergency Management to coordinate with other city agencies to develop guidelines for residential and commercial buildings to deal with weather emergencies and utility outages. And it enumerates some of those topics that should be looked at, which I guess gives you some idea about some regulations that may be coming down the pike eventually. Has to do with flood zones, evacuation zones, protective measures to be installed against flooding, advice on securing window air conditioning units, patio furniture, some things that are fairly obvious, I would think, but regulations on that, how to rent pumps and generators after an outage, methods to communicate with tenants during outages, and the list goes on. There's a very nice discussion of it on the Urban Green Council website, which is urbangreencouncil, all one word, .org. The second part of the law is directed at buildings. And as I said, it will be effective in 180 days, and it directs the owner of residential buildings to post notices. The notices are about whether the building is in a hurricane zone, and if so, which zone it is in, a hurricane evacuation zone, excuse me. The address of the nearest evacuation center, when a person should contact 911 or 311 during a weather event or an extended utility outage, whether during an extended utility outage the building will provide services such as water, which brings us back to the other law that's not going to be effective for some time, but that's one of the issues, whether during the utility outage there will be egress lighting, fire protection, elevators, charging locations for cell phones, heating, cooling, contact information for building personnel during an emergency, instructions on removing furniture from rooftops and balconies during high wind events. I would hope everybody here is already doing that, and that we don't need, you know, and that when storms are coming and hurricanes are coming, that's just sort of part of routine management to deal with that. And the last item that the notices have to deal with, for buildings that do utilize pumps, instructions on reducing water consumption during extended power outages. These are temporary signs. They're supposed to be posted prior to the expected arrival of a weather emergency or after the owner is informed of a utility outage that is expected to last over 24 hours. And there'll be a template to be published by the city in terms of what these signs look like, and they are to be removed after the event has passed. These guidelines, they're mandatory, and therefore they're no enforcement action because everybody should have it up. I'm assuming that means you'll get a violation if you don't, and you'll be fined, and you have to deal with ECB or whoever else it is. You know, in some ways you can say, okay, so we now have new legislation that says we have to put up signs. Big deal, what does that do? I think what it does is it makes you think about what happens during an emergency. How are we going to be prepared? What are we going to think about as opposed to being reactive? It means think ahead. Think about a plan. Think about the elderly in your building. You know, these buildings are communities, and they are home for the residents. The board should be concerned about providing that sense of community and caring and worrying about people there. So the management people and the boards should be focusing now, legislation or not, on what happens. I mean, we've had blackouts in the city. I know I've had buildings that have had fires in them when the emergency stairwell lighting has failed, and there have been terrible smoke conditions. I've had buildings that have had very, very serious floods. I had one building where a standpipe burst and had about 12 floors of apartments trashed. And all kinds of services in the building, including elevators, had to be shut off. These things happen. They're not just weather emergencies. And I think that as much as you don't want to think about the worst case scenario, this is a reminder that we have to start thinking that way if we're not already doing it. And it's important that we focus on it. So this new legislation, it's just posting a sign, but that sign should make you start thinking about what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Margie mentioned that there's a training program for building staff, and I think it's really important. We have these storms. It seems that we have more serious storms more frequently. There's a lot of construction going on in the city. You all know about the crane and how 2 employees of the Department of Buildings had to secure it during Sandy. One of whom has told me to this day he doesn't have a clue as how he made it up there, other than he didn't look down. But there's a lot of construction. I had, during Hurricane Sandy, one of my buildings was a relatively tall building that had had some serious building conditions, and it was undergoing some local 11 work. And because of the wind tunnel effects where this building is located, the contractor was sufficiently concerned that the night of Sandy he spent out on the roof to make sure that all the building materials and everything was secure. I thought that was a fairly amazing story. He said, I had to do it. I had to make sure that everything was properly secured given what the predictions were. So I think we need to focus, we need to plan ahead so that at the last minute you don't have somebody really potentially risking his life out on a roof to take care of that. So I think it's really important. It's a wake-up call, and we should all focus on it. Now also, in terms of planning, there are several other things you might want to think about, which is you have a building office and all the important records are there. What if it's in the basement or the ground floor and you have a flood? What happens to your building records? Do you have documents that are important scanned in? And are they off-site? Are they protected someplace? Do you know what your insurance covers? Jay's clients are going to make sure that you have insurance that they're happy with, but make sure it covers you as well. What does your business interruption insurance look like? Take a look at it. Insurance companies look for excuses not to cover. Some insurance policies have provisions that if there were 2 causes of damage and one of them is not covered, then the loss is not covered. Some insurance companies do not have such a provision, so be aware of that when you're looking at your insurance. Make sure you've looked at your physical plant to deal with potential vulnerabilities down the road. Again, Jay's clients want you to maintain your building, and you want to maintain your building. It's obviously quality of life for your residents, it's protection of the value of an asset, but also it's to avoid damage in one of these extreme situations. If you've been applying Band-Aids to the facade and you get hit with a Hurricane Sandy, what's going to happen? You're much more likely to sustain serious damage than if you have protected the integrity of the facade. So really, I think we have to focus on those kinds of things, how we can be prepared.
And so at this point, going to be Jay to give us an essence of what they're training the staff.
Thank you for having me, Margie. My name is Richard Harris. I'm from the 32BJ Training Fund. We are a separate nonprofit 401c3 from the union. We train exclusively local 32BJ members. So your superintendents, your resident managers, and your commercial cleaners are just some of the members that we have here in the city. After Hurricane Sandy last year, both management and the union came together about what to do with disaster preparedness. We know that a lot of management companies had some plans, but a lot didn't have disaster manuals or anything in place that would help them before, during, and after an emergency. So we've set up a a class for that. It's a 3-hour seminar. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's just meant to get the ball rolling, the conversation started, so that before the next emergency happens, management companies and employees have something in place that they can go to and make sure that the tenants in their buildings are aware of what's going on. And so we like to have it so that the 3-hour seminar isn't just us talking, it's more of a back and forth, an interactive seminar where we get feedback from the members. So we may ask them, well, do you have glow sticks in case the emergency lighting goes out? Because how long can you really think that the emergency lighting is going to stay? Sometimes they'll come back and say, oh, well, it's only going to last out 3 to 4 hours. Do you have glow sticks in place? Why shouldn't you use candles during emergency? So we get into a lot of these things that we talked about with the guidelines that are in place. So before an emergency, do you have everything written down or scanned so that you know who's in the building, who's not, so that after or during the emergency, you're aware of what's going on. During the emergency, what are some things that you're going to have in place? How do you react to what's going on in the news to make sure that you're at the forefront and ready to go when something happens? After, one of our sample questions is, how do you know when you're allowed to go back into the building or allow tenants back in if you've been evacuated? And it's a simple answer, but somebody might think, oh, if the superintendent says it's okay, then we can go back in the building. When in truth, it's the Department of Buildings who has the final say to say, if we evacuated the building, then they're the ones who are going to let you back in. And so after, we also get into how you restart the building, how you get things back to where they were from before. And again, it's not meant to be exhaustive, but it's meant for the building managers to get that information first, so that when they come to you as a management company and you're talking about your plans and what you guys want to do, they're already aware of what's going on. So I'll be here. We have some flyers to give out, and any information that you need, you can feel free to ask me any questions.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Greg Carlson. I'm president of NYARM, and I welcome you this morning in this very important seminar. Executive Director Margie Russell. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you. That's very sweet. I'm going to get right into introducing the speakers. So you're first going to be hearing from an engineer from Rand Engineering, Jamie Ehrman, who has spent several weeks getting buildings up online. And so we're going to hear a lot about what happened with that. And then you're going to be hearing from a construction attorney, David Pfeffer, and he is seeing it from another whole angle. So he will give you his insight. Then we have some insurance aspects we're going to be hearing about from James Fenneman, who's not here yet. And then we have gentlemen from the restoration companies, and they have been on the front line. They truly have been. And so Gary Alexander from Belfour and Howard White from Maxons are going to be taking care of that end of the conversation. James Barry is the program coordinator at 32BJ. So he has been gathering information over the last month or so from the members to find out directly from them what they had to say. At the same time, he's taking information back from today to add to the curriculum so we can build all this information in so the building service workers have you back on this as well. Erwin Cohen, principal at A. Michael Tyler Realty and Management Company, is the moderator and the originator of this. He actually has been after me for a year and has been planning this seminar, and we were going to do it in November, even before we heard about this hurricane. And so then we changed it around to be more of an angle on lessons learned. So at the end of February, we're doing part 2, because there's a far more information than we can possibly cover this morning, and we're going to be learning a lot more as well. Okay, so did I forget anyone? No, good, excellent. Okay, so with that, Jamie, you're on, and you can choose any microphone, freestanding or the lectern.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jamie Ehrman. I'm with Rand Engineering. This is the story of a quick recovery. Okay, so As soon as I got to the building, I was met by board members, the contractors, the agent, and it was constant powwow or meetings and creating an action list and knowing what it was that we need to get to the next step. And the ultimate goal was, let's get a minimum of power restored so that to improve habitability of this building. So we knew that it was rather unfeasible to have temporary power to all apartments. So we made a priority list. What was the systems that needed to be restored? Heat, domestic hot water, one elevator. That was the ideal for this building and pretty much the ideal situation for any residential building. So from there, this building had, what I would consider to be disposable income or more resources available, more financial resources available to them than your average building. So getting a temporary generator was really within their means, and all they needed to know from me was what size. Well, this was my first hurricane, so I did have to take an hour or so to survey the systems, and what I calculated was that they needed about 300 kilowatts. And from there, you can pretty much, it's a good rule of thumb that any building that's down for the count, your typical apartment building, will need about 300 to 400 kilowatts to get the minimum amount of essential services up and running. So that would be your heating plant, pumps, some pumps that are critical during floods, one elevator. So then from there, it was constant coordination. Who was the contractor? What do they need to do? Are they doing what they need to be doing? And that took about 3 days. And it was constant chasing after people. But people were very cooperative. In this emergency, it was essential that everybody perform. If there was a sense that a certain contractor was not performing, then they were quickly shown the door, and you had to get out the phone and find a contractor that would. And it's really, during an emergency, you don't want to have to be doing that, but you have to have people that are proactive. And naysayers just have no place for an emergency recovery effort. So that was the building that got up rather quickly, that they recovered quickly. The next building that I worked with, I would say, was kind of the medium range. And for them, it took about 5 days. So this is 5 days after the first week of the hurricane. And it wasn't a matter of that they didn't have the financial resources. They had some, but they didn't, it was just kind of medium income, so it wasn't as readily available. They couldn't say yes to the big financial commitments as the first building. But there was still a lot of work to be done. Pumps needed to be, motors needed to be changed. The electric was the name of the game for pretty much every building. If you didn't have electric, then there wasn't much you could do. Gas systems tended to fare well during this hurricane, that your average building that was devastated still had their gas up and running. And if you had that was just one less system that you had to worry about. And if your plant operated on gas, then getting your heat up and running was just a matter of maybe rebuilding a burner and getting temporary power to your plant. So again, it was just constant coordination. Correct.
The first building, how many units is next use?
I would say about 100.
100 units?
Yeah.
And this next building?
Oh, it was a 5-building complex, so it was actually like 5 times the size. I'd say probably like 500 units or something. Go ahead.
When you say medium range, first building comes out on your high range, correct?
Yeah, first building was on the high range. That it was like a quick recovery. They had resources.
My question is, not knowing what you're the verbiage you're using.
Okay.
I don't know what medium range, high range.
Okay,
is.
I apologize. That well, in essence, I'm talking about if the emergency recovery took about 3 days.
No,
So that was.
The question is, if you talk more, when you say medium range, high range, is it units? I think that's better understanding.
And not so much the units, more of whether or not they have the financial resources to Okay. Go ahead. What did it draw? Oh, it was diesel. Number 2.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, what was the fuel source for the backup generator? It wasn't a backup generator. It was mobile temporary generators. So I don't want to confuse people thinking that generators were already on site. That your average department doesn't have that luxury of having a temporary generator. If it's a permanent generator that you have on site, gas, absolutely. That gas was the system that fared well in what I would consider to be the most devastating of buildings. That the building that I consider to be the medium building. This was out in the Rockaways, and out in the Rockaways, it was like a Mad Max building, a Mad Max movie. That to get to the building, the sand in the street was 3 to 4 feet high. It was just absolute devastation. The buildings were just crumbled on the way to the site. So fortunately, the structures that I was working with, they fared well because they're your typical concrete, brick, masonry structures. And if the storm, the floods were a foot higher, then that water would have attacked the pressure regulating valves and we would have lost gas. And that would have been a whole different scenario for these buildings. So the level of these waters really made a huge difference. So the fact that they saved their gas system was a massive plus. And it also turned out to be that was the same height level as their main electric. So their utility company, they were down for the count, and we didn't know how long that was going to take. And so in coordinating an emergency restoration, we didn't know how long it was going to take for the utility company to get power on. And also, we didn't have the financial means to bring in temporary generators. And so fortunately, since I was on site all this time, just out of it happened that FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers knocked on our door and said, hey, we're here to start coordinating, tell us what you need. And because I had already surveyed the systems, I was right there and was able to meet with them and say, okay, give me a 1 megawatt generator for each building. This is the conductors I need. This is where we're going to put it. This is how I'd like to see it done. And that saved that much more time in engineering. So being on site for me to see all this stuff and being available was a great advantage. Fortunately, the utility company restored power before those temporary generators were mobilized to the site. But we had no way of knowing that. And in this emergency restoration, you really have to think of, leave no stone unturned. You gotta just keep coming up with a game plan and be creative and just every resource to your availability, go for it and try and get the systems up and running, because people were living in hotels, and it may sound like, oh, this is a nice little vacation, but from what I've heard, no, it was a real help. That hotels were out in Pennsylvania, that was the availability, and FEMA might be paying for it, but their lives were absolutely upside down. And what they were saying to me is, I'd rather be in my apartment if it has heat and hot water and no electric than be in this hotel. Just do whatever you can do, help us, help us. And so that was my experience with there, and also with management. Go ahead.
What would you say you could do going forward to prepare yourself for an event like Sandy?
Well,
what's some of the infrastructure you could put in?
Infrastructure, excellent question, by the way. Well, the question was, what would I do to prepare myself for this going forward? And what I would do is, during the recovery, try and use these repair opportunities to be proactive in strengthening your systems to withstand a hurricane of this magnitude. Now, when the floodwaters comes in, it's really hard to prevent them to not come in. That it was lobbies, they just flooded up, and they flooded up within minutes. So trying to prevent that from happening is, I question the feasibility. However, systems that were on the roof, buildings with systems on the roof, fared much better, 10 times better than with your traditional cellar or basement level systems. Now, it's hard to just move all your systems up to your roof level. So what I'm suggesting to a lot of clients is this, is that before you make a significant financial commitment to restoring your systems, consider a study to make an informed decision on how your system should be restored. Because if you find that I can afford to bring my systems up to the roof level and I have to go through this again, then do it. And also, there might be other ways of protecting your systems that, for instance, for gas, which was the absolute critical system for buildings, getting electric too, but you still need that gas. If you can protect your meters, if you can protect your pressure regulating valves from flood exposure, anything of that sort, that could really be money worth spending. So there's that, and then moving on to the building that is kind of like, all right, well, what this one didn't do as good as the other two was. So once the dust settled and or kind of our office was restored, because Rand's office in and of itself lost power for the whole week because we were Midtown, Chelsea, and we were getting still phone calls from clients, and a building that was completely down. They lost everything, gas, electric, so they had strikes against them than your average, devastated building. But what was kind of the issue here, was the drawback, was this sense of urgency that as soon as I heard it, I was ready to jump in there gung-ho, hey, I can help you out, and stuff like that. But what I was hearing was, okay, let's see proposals for this work. And during this emergency recovery, we were ultra reliant on cell phones and text messages, and the time for reports and proposals and that kind of stuff, the formalities, just wasn't there, obviously, if your building is completely flatlined and you wanted to recover, and that was your top priority. So that is, I guess that's the easiest way for me to say that, is that if you want to recover your building as fast as possible, then owners don't have the leverage that they're accustomed to. So they have to be willing to work with contractors who are willing to work with them, and they have to be willing to say yes. And financial means, of course, is... Go ahead.
I was just curious, the building that one proposed, is that an owner, the board, the management company?
It was, I would have to say that it was the,
Can you please repeat the question?
who wanted the proposals. And what I have to say here is this, is that for all residential buildings that we're accustomed to working with, which is condos and cooperatives, the buck always stops with the board, okay? So they are the decision makers, all right? Management, they are critical to coordination, but the board holds the reins. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay. So there's, that's, the gist of it. I can, go on and more stories. Go ahead.
To what extent were people paying you up front?
Up front?
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, let me explain our fee structure. That I'm an engineer, and all I want to do is engineering. And that's why I work for RAND, because RAND Management takes care of the fees. I get the call, I go. That's the philosophy that I work by, okay? And the clients that we were working with were our long-term clients, because we rely on that business model that we established a relationship, and if you need us, we're there for you. So it really wasn't the time for us to be, worried about our fee. We did get a sense of just a verbal confirmation from our clients. Not that we like to conduct business like this, but nobody likes to conduct business like this. This was a hurricane. This was an emergency. So we got to be realistic here. And we had to deal the same way with contractors too. That contractors, they did at a certain point have to say, okay, you're going to pay me for this, right? And then it was just a matter of getting a simple yes from the board president. And if hopefully everyone is going to acknowledge these conversations, and we haven't really had a problem with this. We're now invoicing for these, and we're going through public adjusters and whatnot, and so it's not a way of doing business that we prefer to be doing, but none of this is a way of doing business that we prefer to be doing. We're just doing the best with what we have to work with. Go ahead.
It sounds like you've had a lot of physical demands on you at the time. Do you recommend that we beef up our gym memberships, or?
Sure.
Can you repeat the question?
There was a lot of physical demands, and do you, what can, should you beef up your gym memberships? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. And I can tell you this, that it was 15-hour days, every day, weekends, and at the end of every day, I would have a conversation with the agent and say, because they knew that I would have to bill for this. And I would say, this is your status, this is the plan for, for tomorrow, do you want me here? And if I heard a yes, then I'll be here, bright and early the next day. And as long as I heard a yes, I'd keep coming back. And then, but as far as getting through the day, get home, get plenty of sleep, and eat right, as long as it is a healthy living mentality will save you in situations like this. It really did. And fortunately, like a week beforehand, I started eating a little bit healthier. And because when your system's down, there are no facilities at your disposal. You are really kind of roughing it. It was cold. It was loud. Once the generators were up and running, I noticed how loud it was, and people started to come back to the building, and it was some of the loudest noise I've ever heard. And I was concerned about children. Not that this is, it's just what I do. So I stopped off at Home Depot and bought some of those earplugs that you can just squeeze and put in your ear, because people were living there, and when they were walking down the street, and this was so tremendously loud that if you're exposed to it for say like an hour or so, you're looking at OSHA compliance issues. So I gave the doorman a box of earplugs and said, if you see kids or just people going outside, offer them these earplugs because it's incredibly loud outside. So yeah, just because you're dealing with an emergency situation doesn't mean that you can just fluff off your health. You got to be healthy before and during and after. Any other questions?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
we'll get to more questions at the end. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you. David, I'm sure you're going to include now when you're doing work without contract or without anything.
Yeah, let me talk. So first, I'm David Pfeffer. I'm a lawyer. Again, I'm David Pfeffer. I'm a lawyer here in New York. I run my real estate development and construction practice group at our law firm, Tarter, Krinsky & Drogen. We have about 60 attorneys there. Most of my clients are real estate developers, owners, and operators. And I want to...
You got to hold it up.
Okay, so in about 8 or 12 minutes, I want to talk to you a little bit about what your duty is as a property manager. Okay? And I'm going to bottom line this for you in basically 3 areas. And it all comes down to one word. I'm going to give you that word now. That's reasonable. You have to act reasonably in the course of your decision making and your operations. And we're going to peel the onion back. But everything you do legally falls into 3 categories. That's tort law. What do you have a duty to do, notwithstanding anything that may be in writing? Okay, so that's 1, tort law. 2 is, contract law. What have you contracted to do, either in writing or orally? And 3, what are the statutory requirements for what you're about to do? As a property manager, your legal obligations will always fall into one of those 3 categories, if not all of them. However, I will bottom line it for you, and that's the word reasonable. You need to act reasonably in what you do. Now, how do you know what's reasonable? Anyone in here? What's reasonable is what the majority of your peers would be doing in the particular situation you're faced with. So in law school, the very first case, just about in every law school across the country, they teach you a banana peel case. And usually the banana peel is located in the aisle of a shopping center. And the question is, what does that owner have to do with the banana peel? We know they have to remove the banana peel because it's the owner's obligation to keep their store clean and safe. We don't want people tripping and falling. But how quick do you have to remove that banana peel? How do you have to remove that banana peel? Okay, so we're in Home Depot every day. What is Home Depot doing when they're putting things up in the aisle or cleaning the aisle? They shut the aisle, okay? That's reasonable to do. That's what a prudent store owner would do. Why? Because it reduces the chance of injury, okay? So when we're looking at the banana peel hypothetical, if that banana peel falls down here at second 1, no reasonable person is going to know at second 2 that fell. But as soon as the manager, the store operator, the store employee finds out about that banana peel, one could argue that it's prudent to act relatively quickly. We don't want people slipping on that banana peel. So whatever you're doing, your actions are measured against your peers, okay? I teach a lot to architects and engineers, and we always talk about this, and we give hypotheticals for hours before the American Institute of Architects. And architects love to talk about what their legal roles are with respect to construction administration, because it's hard. It's not clear. Acting reasonably during construction administration is difficult. What do you do if the architect comes and notices a contractor is up on the building installing the wrong color brick? What do you do as a property manager? You're involved in that construction and you notice that the contractor is installing blue brick instead of red brick. What do you do as a property manager? Well, what's reasonable to do? What would your peers do? Stop the job. Contractor's up on a ladder. How are you going to stop the job? Guess what? It's easy. It's easy. Arguably, the reasonable thing to do in that situation, and very often at the law it comes down to this, is write a letter to the owner. Send an email. Your contractor, who you're in privity of contract with, is installing the wrong color brick. You just did a few things. You protected yourself, right, because you noticed something, you're removing that banana peel, and you're letting the owner know. But if you can stop the job, great. But it's not your obligation to climb up that ladder and pull the contractor off the ladder as a property manager. If you write that letter, 9.9 out of 10 times, you've met your obligations, okay? Now, another way to look at reasonableness is act like a friend. What would a friend do in the exact situation? They'll act timely, they'll give notice, they'll warn against problems. It's not the property manager's job to necessarily come in and clean the backflow preventer. But if there's a problem with the backflow preventer and the property manager knows about it, he better let his client know. Okay, so that's peeling back reasonableness. And in most situations legally, if you're acting like your peers would act, then you're doing a good job. So that's how you want to think about it. Okay, but that's very easy to do. So let's talk about what lawyers could do to trip people up in those situations, okay? You're dealing with a claim situation, and you're confronting someone that wants to kind of show you're not acting reasonably. So I get an expert, I say every property owner in their right mind would have wrote sorry about that. Got it, thank you. Would have wrote the owner a letter in the banana peel situation. Well, the other side might say, hey, wait a second, this property manager, he's a member of this organization today, and they put out a lot of literature about what should be done when there's an emergency. Stop the flow, locate all isolation valves in advance of the leak. Your members here, you picked up one of these today, you know that. Why didn't you do it, Mr. Property Manager? So you want to look at what's being printed in the industry. What's the current recommendations for handling situations? And these things are easily found just today. Here, what do we do when there's a fire at the building? So you want to follow kind of the course of dealings of your industry and the way you act. Okay, the speaker before me, and then I want to wrap it up to give other people a chance and take some questions. But the person before me spoke about the board being your master, okay? The owner being your master. So let's talk about the board a little bit. How's the board's functions evaluated under the law? Anyone know? You're a condo co-op property manager. You're a condo co-op property manager, you're at a monthly meeting, and the board is electing on doing something. Now, it may not be your job to inject yourself into the decision-making process of the board, but you're there on a monthly basis, and something doesn't sound right to you. In New York State, what is the board's responsibility in making decisions? How do you govern? How does the courts, how does the law look at a board's decisions? Yes?
They have a fiduciary responsibility for the corporation.
The answer was they have a fiduciary responsibility to the corporation. That is absolutely 100% correct. However, the courts will usually not peel the onion back that far. The rule, yes?
It's the same rule, reasonable and without any prejudice to make sure there's no conflict of interest.
Actually, the second part you're correct, the first part is not. The courts in most states, including New York State and Delaware, where a lot of our business law comes from, will not look at the reasonableness of the board. Board's decisions, whether it's a property board, a condo board, a co-op board, or the board of IBM, the board's decisions are governed by what's called the business judgment rule. The business judgment rule. And that basically has been judged to mean that the board can do whatever they want as long as two things. It's not an illegal act, okay? And I want to talk about that briefly because a lot of things condo and co-op boards may do may not be lawful. They may not know about it, but it may not be lawful, and the property owner might know about it. And two is, yes, they're generally bound to a fiduciary limitation to protect the shareholders and the owners of the corporation, of the company. Okay? Here in New York, the courts hate to peel that onion back. They don't want to question a board's decisions. And they don't want to question a board's decisions because it opens up a can of worms. Boards should be able to make decisions in their own accord. We're going to give a company's board a lot of power. We don't want to get involved, okay? We'll only get involved where there's a fiduciary issue. And even there has to be bad faith written all over it, okay? So the board, as long as what they're doing in New York State and Delaware and most other states, because most states want to support pro-business, a board's decision is usually going to be upheld unless there's bad faith. In fact, it should always be upheld unless there's bad faith. In fact, the cases talk about giving the boards the power to take risk. We want businesses to take risk. So when we're looking at the fiduciary duty limitation, they're really going to have to show bad faith because taking risk often means losing money or making a bad decision. But we're going to let the boards take the risk. So a board does have tremendous power here in New York State, okay? The only time, as I said, a board's decision will be questioned is bad faith or if there is a breach of some law. Now here in property management, especially in New York City, there's a lot of law, a lot of codes that building owners must follow, okay? So if you, as a property manager, are at one of these monthly meetings and you know that, take a co-op or condo situation that I was talking about an hour ago with one of the panelists, and you know that there's a decision confronting the board with respect to a unit owner's use of their apartment. They have too many people in the apartment, the board wants to get rid of them. Do we have a code in how many people could live in apartments in New York City? Yes, we do. In fact, I believe there's 2. Yes, there's 2. I think the easiest one is about 1 person per, what, 85 square feet, okay? Okay, so if you're taking a hypothetical here, and you're at the monthly board meeting, and you see that the board is about to permit a certain unit owner the ability to have more than that 1 person per 85 square feet, you would have an obligation not to stop the board from enacting a rule permitting more than 85 feet, but you would have a civil obligation to let that board know what the rule is. After that, you're fine. You're fine. You actually probably do not have an obligation to even report that in the state of New York. But you do have to report it to your owner.
So I know you're taking the long route around to our obligation to the board and to the community. But in the situation with what we're dealing with, handshake agreements and contractors need to know and get paid and, you know, and who's on top and who's, so if a board president says, yes, do it, okay, it's the absence of that written document that everyone is feeling they're on thin ice during emergencies.
Okay, so we could talk about that. So here in New York, you're permitted to have written agreements to codify your relationship. And in most cases, where you have some sort of yearly obligation with respect to your owners, you're going to have a written agreement. In New York,
Okay,
wait, I'm going to move forward.
got it,
In New York, you also are permitted in just about all cases to have oral agreements. There are exceptions known as that fall under the statute of frauds, but generally speaking, you're allowed to have oral agreements. Is this a question in the back? Right, so let me talk a little bit about oral contracts, and most of this is common sense, okay? It's very hard to prove the terms of an oral agreement, okay? In order to prove the terms of an oral agreement, you're going to need extraneous evidence, okay? When you have a written agreement, you're often not allowed to introduce extraneous evidence. It's called the parole evidence rule. And there's very tight limitations when you have a written agreement on when you could enter extraneous evidence into evidence. When you have an oral agreement, you're allowed to introduce things outside the scope of your agreement to prove what the terms of the oral agreement are. Okay? So, common sense. We have an emergency situation and you need to do something. The law actually allows you to do something without getting permission. It's called a quasi-contract. Because remember I told you, your job as a property manager is to act reasonably, okay? And in acting reasonably, you're actually allowed to enter into a unilateral contract with your owner that is going to benefit him. The case they teach you in law school, and this is an easy example, is your neighbor is away. Okay? He's on vacation. You know that for a fact. He said, bye, see you next week, going to Florida. You see his dog has gotten out of the house. Okay? It's always the dog situation in law school. They teach you this unilateral contract theory. So you take the dog in. You like dogs, you're a reasonable guy, you love your neighbor. You don't have to take the dog in, but you take the dog in. You gotta buy the dog food, you gotta feed the dog. You may actually even have to come home early to walk the dog. You're allowed, at law, to actually seek compensation for taking care of that dog, even though there has been no acceptance by the dog owner in your actions in taking care of that dog. That's called a quasi-contract. Now, that's not easy to win on in a real-life situation like managing a project. But if you have to, in an emergency situation, rent something, go to the store and buy something, you could actually enforce that obligation on the owner legally. That's one. Two is, what about emails? Now you're in an emergency situation, okay? It's not life or death. You have an hour or so to make a decision. You want to write an email. You want your actions to be documented because you're going to need to enforce that agreement. You're going to need to show that you acted reasonably, like a peer of yours. Okay? So any evidence that could be produced to show that you've acted reasonably is going to help you in supporting your claim for damages, your claim for compensation, and so on. So where you have an oral contract situation, the courts are going to look to what evidence you have to support that agreement. And it's hard, and courts don't like oral contracts because they're hard to prove. So any evidence you have is going to be key in determining whether that agreement, that oral agreement, is going to be enforceable. Any other questions before I turn it over? So, oh yes.
As a contractor, when you're in the middle of an emergency, they want you to do everything. As a contractor, many times in an emergency situation, they want you to do everything. So, being a good contractor, you want to satisfy and please your customer. Are you saying that, as per our conversation, blah, 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 in a text or an email, that would be a good source of evidence in this type of situation? Because sometimes there's selective memory afterwards.
Are you saying that an owner will not pay for something when there's not a signed change order? That would never happen. Yes, exactly what I said is the same thing to do in a situation where you have an owner telling a contractor to do something which may be beyond the scope of the agreement. However, now we're talking about written agreements, and there's a lot of pitfalls with written agreements, okay? One pitfall is that you have a whole process to change or add or delete from the scope of work on a construction project. That's called the change order process, okay? The courts uphold the change order process, okay? So if the agreement says that you need a signed written change order to change the scope of work, either delete from it or add to it, courts are generally going to enforce that. In an emergency situation is different. It's going to be evaluated differently. In fact, even under the AIA standard agreements, contractors are allowed to act in emergency situations. But if it's a general scope of work change, you want that in writing. The contract says it has to be in writing. Plus, the standard AIA agreements and just about every other agreement, especially one that's been reviewed by a lawyer, is going to have a provision that says there can't be any amendments to this contract unless it's signed by the party to be charged. Okay? So, yes, in those situations where there is a change, you want to be able to show that change was accepted or ordered or, somehow required by the owner. Okay, to sum up, again, as a property manager, your responsibility is to act reasonably. The best way to determine whether you're acting reasonably is to look to see what your peers are doing in the industry, including trade journals, things put out by organizations like the one we're all here for today. And the way I like to bottom line it is to act like a friend. If you're acting like a friend to your client, the owner of a building, you're generally going to be okay. Okay? If you're going home early or your property super is not there, there's going to be more issues. Thank you.
James Barrett from 32BJ, and then after James, Gary. You're next, after James.
Good morning. As Margie said, I'm from Local 32BJ Training Fund. Does anyone here have 32BJ workers in their building? Okay, so a lot of you do. You may be aware of the training fund. So the training fund exists to provide training to building workers to improve their work and also to move up to the next level. So what we've been doing recently, post-storm, is trying to gather stories from superintendents and building workers about what they did to prepare, things they did during the storm, and then afterwards, what they did to get their building back up and running. So we're in the process of it, and I just wanted to share some of the first responses that we have. Some of the things have been covered by Jamie, so I just want to kind of highlight some of the ones that weren't. So there was a variety of situations. Obviously, people had no electricity, some people had water damage, a lot of people didn't have phone service, heat, hot water, or water in general. So one of the things people did to prepare is to arrange for people to stay overnight. So when the storm was coming, that they would have workers stay overnight. So they would prepare that ahead of time and go to a 12-hour shift. So instead of doing 3 shifts and having people have difficulty coming in, that they would do 12 hours and just do 2 shifts. And that helped a lot of people out. Another thing was on the communication side. If people had building link, they would send out or some kind of building communication just to do the emergency broadcast, to do text messages, to do emails. As you know, there's always people that don't get the information, so to get it out is in many different ways as possible. That was something a lot of people were wanting to stress. And also to see if some buildings were evacuated, and it became a little complicated to figure out who was in the building and who left the building. So just to have some kind of center in the lobby and always be keeping track of who's in the building and who's not in the building. There were also a lot of guests, people coming in to use facilities, so if a building did have water and the building next to it didn't, people would want to come in and use facilities. So that whole kind of management piece was something that a lot of people said going forward they would want to spend a little more time in arranging roles for people, and also talking to tenants about, if you do stay, this is what's going to happen. So there's 100 tenants, I obviously can't carry water, up the stairs for everyone. So there's special needs people, and we could do these things. But if you're staying, these are some things we wouldn't be able to do if the power goes out, that kind of thing. So during the storm, a couple things people really focused on was lighting in the lobby and the staircases. If people didn't have power, they had generators. People used generators, and a few people strung LED lights up the staircase and just had hours. So you say these are the hours that the staircase is going to be open, or some people had tape that would last for a certain amount of time, but obviously if there's no light, it's going to go dim after a while. And also communication. So intercoms, if people lost power with their intercoms, some supers connected their intercom system to a generator, or had an uninterruptible power source, so you'd have to buy battery backups for that. But that was something, if people felt like there was light in the lobby and the stairs, there was communication, that they would be able to reach out to people. That was sort of the basic things that people seem to get a little more relaxed if those things were provided. I think also just something kind of interesting. Some of the people by the water had sandbags, and some of them didn't have sand. So one of them said they actually went to a sandbox, a children's sandbox, and that's how they filled their sandbags. So I thought that was kind of funny. And in terms of the aftermath, so once the storm is over and let's say you're going to get power back and water back, to make sure that you go throughout the building and make sure that everything's turned off and the water's turned off as well. A lot of people when the water went off, they had their fountains or their faucets in the open position. So you want to make sure that everything is turned off, so when you put the water back on, obviously there's no leaks or floods. So those are just a few things. We're going to be gathering more information. There were stories of some people stopped using the elevator at a certain time, put it up in the top floor. Other people had, if the elevator stopped and they weren't ready, that they had to go and check and make sure there weren't people stuck in the elevators. But I think in general, the overall is that everyone feels like there needs to be more planning around roles for people in the storm. We have a variety of training. We have CERT training. We also have emergency evacuation plan training. So if you do have a 32 BJ worker, that's something we could do. I'm going to leave catalogs here. So we're going to filter in some of the information we get to make it more relevant to these particular situations, going forward. So does anyone have any questions? Good.
Thank you, Jim.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Gary Alexander from Johnson.
Good morning. My name is Gary Alexander. I am from a company called Belfour. We are actually the largest property damage restoration company in the world, believe it or not. We are not a franchise. We're privately owned. And one of the benefits of our company is it's so large that we get people from all over the country that come and help us. We have access to equipment, like we're talking about a lot of discussion about generators and things, and because of our connections with certain companies, we're able to get equipment like that to do our work. But I wanted to go back to some of these legal things that we're talking about between Jamie and David about contracts and things. And we're doing one of the projects that I'm doing is a library in Long Beach, and the school district owns the building, and the library leases the building from the school district. No contract, believe it or not, no lease or anything between them. And the library had some insurance flood insurance for their contents, and we had to take, what people forget about a storm like this and what the type of damage it was is the flood waters are considered Category 3 water, which means it's sort of like sewage. Because there's sewage mixed in with it, there's whatever chemicals are out the street, that's all in your buildings now. So it has to be handled in a particular way. And one of the things we had to do was move all the books from the first floor, 2,471 boxes to be exact, had to go from the first floor up to the second floor. So the library had the contents, but the school district didn't even realize they had the building. They had no insurance. So when we're talking about contracts, I always get an authorization, and I'm sure when Howard speaks, he'll say the same thing, which essentially says that you're authorizing us to do the work and that we act as your agent to get paid from your insurance company, and in lieu of that you will pay us. So I made sure that the school district signed that, and about 2/3 of the way through our mitigation part of it, I get an email from the district saying, stop, we don't think that we have to pay to put the building back together. But because I had that piece of paper, I was able to finish the phase 1 part, which is the remediation part, and I think that helped us in that regard. And it also helps to make crystal clear, Dave was talking about emails and things. I'll always get an email, like in this particular case, I would write down specifically what items that the school district was going to be responsible for, and then the items that the library was responsible for, so that I had a running record of what everyone said, and it makes it clear for everybody. Some of the other projects, we're talking about condominiums, where many of them are like this building, where you have to walk 4 or 5 steps down into the lobby to take the elevator up. Well, these became swimming pools, and people couldn't get out of their apartments or condos. Couldn't get an elevator, couldn't take the stairs, they had no heat, no water, they couldn't flush a toilet, no food, nothing. So you have to pump these things out so people can actually get out of their building. And then one of the other issues that we deal with in these situations is the insurance. Some people have flood insurance, which if those of you who may or may not know, flood insurance, it's not really the best policy in the world. It doesn't cover a lot of things, but the decision that the manager was making was based specifically on what they were going to get reimbursed from the insurance company. So rather than coming in and just knocking a job out, you would come in and you'd do certain parts of the job, and then he would go, I'll do a little bit more, or don't do this, don't do that, because he wasn't going to get covered for it. So I don't have an answer for what that is, except make sure you have enough insurance and know exactly what it covers. Because in a lot of cases, if you're below grade, flood insurance does not cover for finished, like it'll give you unfinished sheetrock. It won't cover for carpeting. It won't cover for furniture. It won't cover for, unless you specifically get coverages for that. So those were sort of some of the things that we kind of ran into. I don't know if anyone had any questions on that? Comments, concerns, winning lottery numbers?
What were some of the other biggest challenges that you faced as a restorer and helping a lot of people?
Too many. The question was some of the problems, the bigger problems that we ran into in restoring these things. And really one of the biggest problems is just sheer volume. You just can't handle, I don't know that you guys can appreciate what that's like. I mean, the phone just rings off the hook with people that were, in fact, Howard and I were joking before that during the course of a year, a lot of people don't want to talk to you because they're busy doing their everyday work, and then when something like this hits, all of a sudden you're everyone's best friend, which is okay. It's, that's the nature of the business. But getting help and labor for all of these things is always an issue. Again, because we're a large company, we're able to get more than probably a lot of other companies can. One of the great things about Belfour is we have so much equipment. We have tractor trailers that filled with drying equipment that we're able to put in different positions. We're able to do that. But probably one of the biggest things is, biggest problems is labor, getting good labor. And then the other thing is the insurance part of it, because some of these bills, as you know, get pretty hefty. And you don't want to stick somebody with a large bill if they're not covered for it. So that, it's always it's a balancing act that you have to walk, that you do take care of the fundamental needs of the building and the people in it without overstepping kind of your bounds, and as far as, again, sticking the building with huge bills. So that's always a problem. Getting around was a problem, as you know, with a lot of the streets being closed and the trains and all of that weren't running, so the traffic was something that should have taken you half an hour. It takes you 3 hours to get to it. Fuel was a problem. Luckily, we were able to get these large fuel, what they call fuel bibs, where they're like 700 gallons each, and we would get a delivery every day so we could keep up. That would be crippling if you couldn't get something as simple as fuel. Things like that. It's a very interesting process. I've been doing this for 36 years. I know I'm only 38, but I've never seen anything like this. This is quite an ordeal. Yes?
Were you able to sustain your fuel supply over that course of the snow?
Were we able to sustain our fuel supply? Yeah, we were lucky enough that we could get deliveries every day to fill up, but it's not just trucks, it's all those portable generators and all that kind of equipment that you need fuel for. There was a question earlier about what's the best kind of fuel to run your generators on. Unfortunately, because it's of such an emergency nature, you have to take whatever you can get and hope that you can get fuel for it. Luckily, that kind of worked out. And what happens is you get people from out of state bringing trucks of, in fact, when the gas crunch first hit, we sent a truck up to Connecticut to fill up all our gas cans with fuel because we didn't know if we were going to be able to get it.